What I would like to do is present a new gardener extension proposal for automated seed management. This is according to our process where we want to, before actually start working on something, to gather feedback from the community, especially on major things. And so this proposal is bringing together several topics under the common umbrella of automated seed management. These topics are the ones you can see in the 3 bullets in the beginning of the document. It's first of all making sure that we have the concept of capacity for shoots in a seed and that is not exceeded. Second, we want to be able to create, delete, and update seed declaratively, something that is not possible today. And finally, is probably the last step that depends on the previous two. We would like to be able to auto-scale seeds when certain capacity thresholds are reached. And the guiding principle for this has been that since seeds are in many respects similar to nodes, and shoots are in many respects similar to pods in the sense that shoots are scheduled onto seeds similarly to how pods are scheduled onto nodes in Kubernetes. We leverage any successful approaches we already find in Kubernetes for this proposal as well. Of course, there is a limit to this analogy, right? I say similar, but similarity goes only so far, and therefore some things have to be done differently. Okay, the first topic regarding ensuring seed capacity for shoots is not exceeded. Basically, what we are doing, we are introducing the concept of a resource that a seed can have, and the capacity for this resource, and for some resources, the amount reserved for gardener. The idea is to make the gardenlet aware about this capacity and reserved values, and then to update the status of a seed with the capacity of each resource and how much of it is actually available, using fields such as capacity and allocatable, which is quite similar to the corresponding fields in the node status. Finally, the scheduler should be influenced by the remaining capacity. In the simplest possible implementation, it should simply avoid scheduling shoots onto a seed that has reached that capacity. And the one prominent resource that we need to take into account is the number, simply the number of shoots. It's also similar to Kubernetes where you have number of pods in the capacity of the node. We considered being able to request certain resources in shoots, similarly to how this is done in pods. But we figured out that here our analogy breaks a little bit because shoots are not really aware about seed resources and how much of them do they consume, although they do consume resources. How much do they consume is largely dependent on our implementation in Gardener, and very little or not at all on any peculiarities of the shoot itself. And therefore, such requests would not be that meaningful, and they are not proposed here. We also considered some extensibility scenarios where we could probably in the future have resources that are provider specific and for which we would need some extensibility concept to properly advertise such resources and update the seed status with them. Again, here the analogy with nodes and resource plugins in Kubernetes is not very good, and therefore we did not base such a proposal on the existing examples. Instead, we just decided to leave it open for now and maybe write a separate GEP for this thing when it becomes necessary. And here you can see an example of a shoot status with capacity and allocatable fields, where we have, of course, the number of shoots, the thing we are mostly interested in initially. You could also have some additional resources that shoots may consume. If we introduce such resources, we may have a more precise idea about capacity and maybe better scheduling, and maybe also some provider-specific resources. Okay, how does the Gardenlet actually know the capacity? Well, for now, it's just a configuration, which looks like this in the Gardenlet configuration file. So you can specify certain resources, and you can reserve some of them for use by Gardener itself. The scheduling algorithm, as mentioned, the current scheduler of Gardener is rather simple. It will filter out resources based on certain criteria and then determine the best candidate based on the region, and also choose one with the least number of shoots. So the initial step should be that simply during the filtering stage, any seeds that exceed their capacity for shoots are simply filtered out and not considered during the next stages. Later on, if this becomes necessary, we could consider changing the scheduler algorithm, where the step in which we are evaluating the so-called region strategy is replaced by a scoring step, similar to the one that is used in the Kubernetes scheduler. In this step, the scheduler ranks the remaining seeds in order to choose the most suitable shoot placement. And to rank them, it assigns a score to each seed that survived the filtering stage based on a list of rules. And now that may include also region-based rules, such as minimal distance, but also rules related to the allocation of seed resources. Just this could be just an example rule, seed resources list allocated. And then each rule produces its own score for the seed. The overall score is calculated as a weighted sum of all such scores, and the scheduler chooses the seed with the highest ranking, with the highest score. Again, this is a probable future enhancement. Whenever we find ourselves in a situation where we might ignore, or not ignore, but deprioritize the importance of a region compared to the fact that we have a shoot with a lot of free capacity, which would make sense in some situations. Typically, we want to consider the region, but in some cases where all the nearby seeds are close to capacity and there is a seed with a lot of free capacity, somewhere farther away, we could probably favor this seed compared to the closer ones. And this is where introducing such a scheduling algorithm might make sense. Okay, so this is the first topic in this automated seed management. The second topic is creating, deleting, and updating seeds declaratively. What does this actually mean? What we want to be able to do is that whenever a seed are near capacity, we could add additional ones in order to accommodate more shoots. And conversely, sometimes we want to be able to retire seeds when there's simply too many of them for the current shoot usage. So currently, however, the number of creating a new seed involves a number of manual steps. First, we need to create a shoot somewhere, then register it as a seed in Gardener, and maybe even deploy Gardenlet to it. This could be automated already to some extent by using a special annotation, the so-called use a seed annotation, which is referred to in the document here. But again, this still requires manually creating all the needed shoots, annotating them, and then making sure that they are properly reconciled and registered. So what we need is a resource, I call it a creatable seed, and then a set of such resources, similarly to how in Kubernetes we have pod and replica set, and in MCM you have machine and machine set. Maybe in the future we could also talk about deployments of such creatable seeds. I will expand upon this topic a bit later on. And then with such a resource, we could create new seeds based on a template, and with the set resource and the replicas field, we could simply increase the replicas field in order to add more seeds, or in some cases also delete seeds. Okay, so first of all, we need this creatable seed resource, and there is already an issue which proposes a certain approach. So what we have in the document is just expanding upon the proposal there. We call it a shooted seed resource. This is consistent with the terminology we have so far. We also call the resources with the user seed annotation shooted seeds. So what does this resource have? Here's an example. So we have a shoot template, which contains the specification of a shoot and parts of it metadata, such as labels and annotation. Then we also have the seed template in a similar way. And we also have a Gardenlet section because we need to deploy Gardenlet onto that shooted seed. So for Gardenlet, we have, first of all, a flag whether it's enabled or not. In some cases, we don't want to enable Gardenlet. We also have a section about the Gardenlet deployment itself. Basically, more or less everything we can already configure for a Gardenlet deployment can be specified in this section. Of course, most of these things have meaningful defaults, and it should be rarely specified in practice. And we also have the Gardenlet configuration that I also mentioned when discussing the previous section. Which is needed, of course, when deploying Gardenlet. So when we have these three things, what we can do is then a controller can reconcile this resource similarly to how the controller that currently reconciles the user seat annotation. And the natural place to put this controller is gardenlet. So the controller would then create, delete and update shoots, seats, and gardenlet deployments as needed. And once this is considered sufficiently stable, the current user seat annotation could be deprecated and eventually removed. Something to keep in mind is that maybe this shooted seed resource should be namespaced, unlike the seed resource, because we also have in mind the concept of private seeds, which is another thing that is proposed in an issue, and I don't want to expand upon it in much detail. Maybe it will result in introducing another special resource, private seed. The idea is to be able to only use seeds, some such private seeds from a project in which they exist, and to only be able to even see them if you have permissions on a certain project. So the idea is that a shooted seed can be created. If it's created in the garden namespace, then it's globally available. But if it's created in a project namespace, then the shooted seed controller could probably create such a private seed whenever we have it in the future, because this is also another concept that is not implemented yet. Okay, so that's more or less about shooted seeds. And now we come to shooted seed sets. So a shooted seed set is basically very similar to a replica set. It has a replicas field for the number of replicas. It has a selector to basically to identify the seeds that are managed by the set or that are included in the set. And it has a template. And the template, of course, is just shooted seed resource and metadata. And there should be labels in the metadata matching the labels in the selector. We need, of course, a controller for such shooted seed set, most likely again in gardenlet. And it would simply watch the replicas and selector fields and create or delete shooted seeds in response to changes. When I say simply, it's not that simple actually, especially when we talk about deleting seeds, because a seed that has shoots already scheduled, already using it, cannot be simply deleted unless the shoots are deleted or moved to other seeds first. So here we want to make sure that this is checked by the controller, and a decrease in the replicas field is only possible if the corresponding number, there is a corresponding number of free seeds, otherwise it simply fails. In the case where there are actually more free seeds than the number that we want to delete, there is another challenge, basically to determine which of these seeds we want to delete. And to do that, we should use some heuristics and possibly also hints that can be manually added by the user, perhaps in the form of annotations. We could, let's say, have an annotation to say that a certain seed must not be deleted, even though it's empty. We could have another annotation specifying that we would like this seed to be deleted um, before other seeds. Intentionally, the document doesn't go into much detail here. This will have to be clarified as part of the implementation. And I mentioned deployments. We considered shooted seed deployments in addition to shooted seed sets. But we quickly figured out that here seeds tend to be much more heavyweight compared to pods and even nodes in Kubernetes. And therefore, if we start updating seeds by introducing new seeds and moving shoots to them, that would be possible actually with the shoot control plane migration feature that has been introduced in a different proposal, and that is almost implemented and close to being rolled out to production usage. However, we don't have any practical experience with that. We suspect that it will be rather complex, time-consuming, and somewhat prone to failures compared to simply updating the seeds in place. Therefore, we right now refrain from proposing shooted seed deployments. But of course, in the future, this may come in a separate proposal. Finally, I would like to touch upon the subject of auto-scaling seeds. So now that we have a resource with a replicas field, we could also think about auto-scaling. And similarly to how in Kubernetes, the horizontal pod autoscaler scales pods. And again, the metric for scaling, one of the primary candidates, so to say, could be and should be the number of shoots already scheduled onto that seed, either as a direct value or as a percentage of the seed's capacity for shoots that was previously introduced. And later, maybe we could introduce other custom metrics based on other resources. We briefly considered even using the existing horizontal pod autoscaler for scaling shooted seed sets, because it can actually scale any resource with a scale subresource using a custom metric. But for many reasons that I don't want to expand upon, we decided against it. There was some considerable drawbacks with this approach, and therefore we are now looking into creating our own seed autoscaler, which is of course quite similar to the horizontal pod autoscaler. It operates based on a special resource which may look like this. So it has a target resource reference, which should be of a type shooted seed set, has a minimum and maximum number of replicas, and it has a number of metrics that it can consider. The most prominent one being the number of shoots. Now here, whether to put that controller in Gardenlet or maybe create it as an out-of-tree controller, similarly to the current cluster autoscaler, that's something to be decided as part of the implementation. And also the controller could take into account not only metrics, but other things such as stains, label selectors. To do that properly, we would need to extend the seed autoscaler resource presented above. This is not yet done. For the sake of simplicity, needs to be further expanded upon when we enter the actual implementation phase. Okay, so this is what I wanted to present, and I'll be happy to hear your feedback about this proposal.
I left a note on the proposal to regarding the nomenclature around seeds and the possible commonality to roles and cluster roles, for instance. Seems like it would be pretty disruptive to upgrades to actually call them cluster seed and seed instead of seed and private seed. but it might be something long-term that is easier for new users to kind of reconcile back to the way things are named already in existing Kubernetes.
So this is regarding private seats.
Correct, yeah.
What you're proposing is maybe renaming that to cluster seats. Okay, just to seats and the current seats to cluster seats.
Correct, but
Yes.
recognizing that could be a very disruptive upgrade for people who are already, you know, deeply that have large garden clusters set up.
Private seats are not really in the focus of this GEP. Thanks for the suggestion. I think private seats maybe deserve their own GEP and their own discussion. So there will be, I guess, discussion to consider, naming especially. Okay, any other questions or comments? Does it make sense?
Hi, this is Daniel. I got one question. So in the past, we've seen issues with, for instance, rate limits or certain limitations on, for instance, in Azure on subscription basis that are cloud provider specific and sometimes also arbitrary. So my question would be, how would this seed autoscaling work? How could it take these kind of things into consideration? For instance, placing a new seed into a new Azure subscription, and how would it even know about these kind of limitations? Is there, maybe I missed that when I read it, but maybe what are your thoughts on that?
There is a note actually about it, but it doesn't say much. What it says is that sometimes bootstrapping a new seed might require additional provider-specific actions like the one you mentioned. So requesting rate limits, getting a new subscription, extending quotas, and so on. Our assumption is that all of it could be eventually automated by introducing an extension mechanism in the bootstrapping flow of Gardener. And it's not really about auto scaling. So auto scaling is just you know, of course it's impacted, but even the simple creation of a shooted seed is impacted as well, right? So even we have the problem even today without all these mechanisms that I introduced here. So again, our assumption is this can be automated by a new type of controller. I did not consider it in the scope of the current proposal, and this might come in a separate proposal. So right now, if we go for the implementation of shooted seeds and sets and auto scaling, this will not be addressed, and therefore, in some cases, it would simply not be possible to auto-scale seeds. But later on, when this is introduced, and it can be introduced completely independently of the contents of this proposal here, this issue is hopefully solved.
Okay, yeah, so you basically regard it as a separate topic. But exactly. Okay, you got it on the list.
Yeah, we have it. We have it in mind.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Tim. Thanks for presenting your GEP in the meeting. Maybe you can give us a quick outlook or outline your plans on how and in which order these topics should be implemented. For those who haven't already followed the discussion, this might be interesting.
Yes, the order is pretty much the order in which they are ordered in the document. Of course, there are some more advanced things that can be added later. Like, for example, ensuring seed capacity for shoots is not exceeded. This one is already ongoing, more or less, but only a very only the simplest, so to say, piece where we introduce the shoots resource and also modify the scheduler to take it into account. Additional resources and especially provider-specific resources can come later, not considered as important as other things. Gardenland configuration is also practically already done. The simplest change to the scheduling algorithm is also in process. This more radical change to the scheduling algorithm where we introduce scoring rules and ranking based on scoring rules can come later again. Probably the easiest, probably what we should do is once this GEP is merged, based on the content of the GEP, I will create a number of issues, or maybe just one issue or a couple of epic issues, and then some task issues with the respective implementations. And there it will be more clear what are the priorities.